Hi, this is my mom, Jessica Horst, and we're going to read the
Trolley Car Family. This is one of my favorite books when I was in elementary school, originally published in 1947 by Eleanor Clymer. What is a trolley car family? A family that lives in a trolley car, of course. And that's what the Parkers decide to do. Ma and Pa Parker and Bill, George, Sally, and Peter Parker, too. Pa Parker drives a trolley car. Trolley cars used to go clanging down streets of most American towns and cities. Then cars and buses took their place. But Pa Parker loves his trolley car. He won't give it up to drive a bus. So off go the Parkers in their trolley car home. It's just for a little while, they say, if only they knew the surprises that lie ahead. You're being very selfish right now. This first chapter is called The Noisy Parkers. Chapter 1, The Noisy Parkers. Mr. Jefferson was a cross man. He was cross in the morning and he was cross at night. He was cross when he met people and he was cross when he was alone, which was most of the time. Mr. Jefferson was a milkman in the little town of East Sawyerville. He had to get up in the dark and go out and hitch up his horse while everybody else was sound asleep in bed. Then he had to drive to the dairy and get his milk. Then he had to drive around delivering the milk. At 4 o'clock in the morning, his bony white horse could be heard clapping through the quiet streets of East Sawyerville. Mr. Jefferson would walk along the sidewalk from one door to the next by the light of the street lamps, leaving bottles of milk and cream. When he was all finished, he would climb up on the seat of the milk wagon, pull his old hat down over his eyes, and slap the reins on the horse's back. The horse would start for home. People would be getting up now. They would come out and take in their milk and call, "Good morning," to Mr. Jefferson as he went by. Mr. Jefferson would grunt in reply and slap the reins on the horse's back again. "Gotta get home and get some sleep," he would mutter to the horse. "Can't stay out here talking all day." The horse would amble along, and just as he was turning into the driveway that led to the stable behind the house, out would come the Parkers. It was the Parkers who made Mr. Jefferson cross, though they certainly didn't know it and would have been very much surprised if anybody had told them. The reason was that there was such a lot of them, and they made so much noise. They lived in a little house next door to Mr. Jefferson. Their house was much too small for them, but they didn't mind. They were always jolly and noisy, especially the first thing in the morning, just when Mr. Jefferson was feeling sleepiest and crossest. Mr. Parker was a motorman for the trolley car company, and that was why they liked their little house, even though it was too small for them. It was only 2 blocks from the car barn, and the trolley tracks went right past the door. Every morning, just as Mr. Jefferson was coming home, the door of the Parkers' house would open, and all of them would come bouncing out on the porch. Then a trolley car would come along. Clang! The bell would go, and there would be Pa at the wheel. He would wave to his family, and they would all wave back and shout, "Goodbye, Pa!" Then the car would rattle away, and the Parkers would go inside. But that didn't mean they would be quiet. Oh, no. First, there would be a rattle of dishes being washed. Then they would shout to each other up and down the stairs. Then some of them would come out to play, and they would yell to the others who stayed inside. And meanwhile, in his house next door, Mr. Jefferson would be muttering to himself over his lonesome breakfast. "I know I won't be able to sleep with that racket going on." On weekdays, of course, the older children went to school. But then, just as Mr. Jefferson managed to doze off, about lunchtime, back they would come, laughing and calling out to each other. Saturdays and Sundays were the worst. Then the children were all home, and Mr. Jefferson found it hard to get a wink of sleep. There were 6 in the family. First, of course, there was Mr. Parker. He wore a motorman's cap and a big mustache. Then there was Mrs. Parker. She was short and plump and usually wore a checkered apron. Red and white checks were her favorite, though she sometimes wore other colors. She was so busy that she didn't often have time to take her apron off. Sally, the oldest child, had short yellow braids and brown eyes. She was 11. Bill was 10. He was a big boy for his age, with broad shoulders and strong arms and legs. He was proud of his muscles and planned to be a baseball player when he grew up. George, who was 8, was just the opposite of Bill. He was thin, with straight yellow hair and a faraway look in his eyes. He didn't always answer when he was spoken to because he was often so busy with his own ideas that he didn't hear. Peter, the baby, was 2. The children all said hello to Mr. Jefferson whenever they met him, but he usually just grunted in reply. He didn't want to encourage them. Sometimes on Sundays, the whole Parker family would turn out for a picnic. Then Mr. Jefferson would say to himself, now I have a chance to get a nap. All 6 Parkers would pour out of their little house, each one carrying something. Picnic baskets, baseball bats, umbrellas, kites. They would stand on the porch till a trolley car came along, and then they would all climb on board and go for a ride. Mr. Jefferson couldn't see why Mr. Parker, who drove a trolley car every day, would want to go for a trolley car ride on his day off. He would wait till they were all out and then settle down for his nap. But for some reason, he couldn't sleep when they were gone either. Maybe it was too quiet. Maybe he missed the good smell of cake baking that so often came from Mrs. Parker's kitchen. Anyway, he would find himself waiting and waiting until they got home in the evening, all tired out with dirty faces and empty picnic baskets, and little Peter sound asleep on his father's shoulder. Next morning, everything would be back to normal. Mr. Jefferson would be crossly muttering about the noisy neighbors. The Parkers would be loudly calling good morning to him and wondering what made him so cross. Mama, Sally would report, I just said hello to Mr. Jefferson when I took in the milk, and he just said, Poor man, her mother would say, shaking her head. He's got nobody to cook him a good hot breakfast. Living all alone like that, goodness knows when he gets a good meal. Couldn't I take him some biscuits? Sally would ask. Of course, said Mrs. Parker, but don't disturb him. Leave the plate on the porch and run back, George advised, but Sally would not do that. She just always knocked at the door and waited till Mr. Jefferson opened it a crack and peered out. Some biscuits my mother just made, she would say. Mr. Jefferson would mumble, thanks, and then take the plate and shut the door as soon as possible. I think he just wants to be cross, Sally said to her family. Mr. Parker thought it was because he worked at night and slept in the daytime. It's not natural for a man, he said, but Ma said no. It's just that he's got so used to living alone and being lonesome, she said. He's afraid if he gets used to company, he'll want it all the time. Well, what's wrong with that? Bill asked. Nothing, said Ma, but it's not for us to tell him what's good for him and what isn't. So you children just leave him alone until such time as he decides to be sociable. But all forbidden things are bound to be interesting. The more you try to walk away from them, the more likely they are to pop right up in front of you. For instance, there was Mr. Jefferson's horse, Whitey. Bill was very much interested in the horse, who, when he wasn't working, liked to stand with his head sticking out of a window in the stable. Then he could look around and see what was going on. He was a friendly horse. Bill and George liked to stand on the other side of the fence and talk to the horse. The horse would wag his head up and down or blow through his lips at them. I'd like to go over and pat him, said Bill one day, even if I can't ride him. Guess Mr. Jefferson wouldn't like that, said George. The two were leaning over the fence eating apples. Let's give him a piece of apple, said George. How are you going to do that without going over there? Bill asked. George looked around. His eye fell on his little brother Peter, digging in a corner of the yard. He borrowed Peter's shovel. He put the apple on the shovel and held it out to Whitey. The handle was just long enough to reach. Whitey got the apple between his big lips and munched it. He wagged his head up and down and whinnied. He wants more, said Bill. He grabbed the shovel, placed his apple on it, and held it out. But he was in too much of a hurry. He dropped the apple. Then he reached for it and dropped the shovel. Little Peter saw his shovel on the other side of the fence and began to scream, My shovel! He yelled. Wait, Peter, said Bill. My shovel! Peter bellowed. Whitey stamped in his stall and whinnied again. Bill climbed over the fence to get the shovel. Sally looked out of the window and called, Bill, you come back here. You're not allowed to do that. My shovel! Peter wept. Keep quiet, all of you, Bill shouted. You'll wake up Mr. Jefferson. Just then, Mr. Jefferson's bedroom window banged open, and Mr. Jefferson's face appeared, very cross. What's the matter down there? He growled. Can't a man get any sleep? Old Whitey looked up at his master in the window. He whinnied. It sounded exactly as if he were laughing. Mr. Jefferson banged the window down. Bill gave the apple to Whitey and climbed back into his own yard. His mother was standing on the back steps. "It's too bad," she said, that poor man had to go and live right next to a family of children like you. But it can't be helped, and I don't want any of you going over there. And that's final." "But the horse," Bill began. "Maybe sometime when you're bigger," said his mother, "you can go to a farm and get real friendly with some horses. But in the meantime, you'll just have to be content with looking at the horse." Then there was the time the Parkers' cat had kittens. There were 3 of them, coal black, like their mother. Just like Nona's. Little Peter loved the kittens so much that he almost choked them with his hugs. As soon as the kittens could run, they learned to run away when they saw him coming. And of course, the family did all they could to teach Peter that he had to be careful. But Peter could run faster than the kittens, and he loved them so much that the sight of them chased all other ideas out of his curly little head. One day, the kittens disappeared. The children looked everywhere for them, but they simply weren't to be found. The house was searched from cellar to attic. So was the yard and the woodshed. The mother cat appeared at lunchtime, ate her lunch, and went to sleep. The children watched her in order to follow her when she woke up and went back to her babies. But she was too smart for them. She disappeared too when they forgot to watch her for a minute. "Kitty, kitty, kitty," Peter called sadly, walking around and around the yard and looking under every stick and stone. "I bet I know where they are," said George. "I bet she took them over to Mr. Jefferson's house. She knows we can't go over there." "Maybe they're in the stable," said Bill. "You go over and look, but don't make any noise." George didn't climb over the fence. He crept cautiously around the end, then edged toward the stable, keeping close to the fence on Mr. Jefferson's side. He got safely inside the stable without being noticed. Whitey stamped his feet a bit, but he didn't whinny. It was fairly dark inside the stable. George stepped quietly around, but he could see no sign of any cats. He peered into all the dark corners, but of course the cats were black and couldn't be easily seen without a flashlight. Why hadn't he thought to bring a light? George climbed up a short ladder that led to the little hayloft. He felt about in the hay. Suddenly he saw something glowing like a little light. Then he saw some more little lights, green and round. Why, they were the cat's eyes glowing in the dark. "Meow," said the 3 little kittens. He stuffed all 3 little kittens inside his shirt and climbed down the ladder. But the kittens clawed at him and tickled his ribs inside his shirt, and he giggled and missed the lowest rung and fell, knocking over a couple of feed buckets and making the most awful noise. Whitey stamped and whinnied. The kittens squealed, and Bill, waiting on the other side of the fence, called out, "Are you all right, Georgie?" George came out, face to face with Mr. Jefferson, who had come down to see who was breaking into his stable. "The kittens ran away," George explained. "I don't blame them," said Mr. Jefferson crossly. "They probably wanted a little peace and quiet." And he turned and walked back into his house. The children didn't think that was quite fair. "If he hadn't always been so cross," said George, "I could have asked him to let me look in his stable, and then I wouldn't have had to be so quiet. It's always when you're trying too hard to be quiet that you make the biggest noise." And that's the end of chapter 1. Tune in for chapter 2.